Good morning. My name is Femi Olugbemiro, and this presentation really is to examine LGBTQ communities as a counterculture. My colleague had talked about LGBTQ communities as a subculture, and while looking at these two concepts, we found out that depending on the geography, you find these two communities or cultures expressed either as a subculture or a counterculture. And so we'll dive right in to the entire concept of by giving it a definition at first. Well, a description, I would say. And we say that a culture is a culture which essentially runs in opposition to dominant culture. And oftentimes it rejects the values and acceptable norms of the dominant culture while attempting to assert its its position in society. And so we find out that the LBGTQ community oscillates between being a subculture and being a counterculture. And this, like I said earlier, this is reflected by the fact that you find out that in Western cultures, it has become more leaning towards the mainstream, such that it is considered not an if a part is considered a part of the dominant culture and is acceptable. Whereas in Africa, in Asia, and Middle Eastern countries, you discover that it is regarded as fringe almost, and the dominant culture is not so welcoming to it as a subculture. So the perception about LBGTQ in most of sub-Saharan Africa is influenced by both cultural and religious considerations, and of course, in many African countries, because there is an existing culture that is rooted oftentimes in religious belief, you find out that where the religion does not support it, then the culture also embraces the position of the religion. And so, whether it is Christianity or Catholicism or Islam or just the traditional religious beliefs across Africa, there is the general belief that homosexuality, for example, is unnatural. And because it is unnatural, people who engage in homosexuality are doing something against God's design or divine design. And that essentially pitches LGBTQ communities against a very strong opposition, where oftentimes LGBTQ communities are either non existent or even those who are inclined to one of the expressions of being LGBTQ will rather keep quiet about it, maybe even for the fact of their safety. And so, in many African countries, it is dismissed oftentimes by the political class as a Western concept, And then ordinary people simply consider it as sacrilegious and even outrightly offensive. So, like my colleague did with the subculture, we'll look at aspects of, of culture and the reaction that you get that allows us to propose this idea that it is a indeed a counterculture in many cultures outside Western cultures. So, of course, the definition of marriage in many religious and cultural settings is essentially based on the binary interpretation of sex and gender. Okay, and so because of that, when you talk about same sex marriage, for example, it doesn't connect culturally with people from certain parts of the world. And so, because predominantly patriarchal cultural systems, of course, essentially conflict with LBGT values about marriage. And a bit of some statistics here in Africa, out of 54 countries which the United Nations and the African Union recognize as being part of the African continent, 34 of these countries have an outright anti-gay law. In other words, same-sex marriage is banned in those countries. Of course, the only exceptions are South Africa and Cape Verde, which South Africa was probably one of the first few countries in the world to adopt same-sex marriage, a law that was essentially passed through the courts, the Supreme Court of South Africa. Okay, and then of course, so same-sex marriage is illegal in all of the 18 countries in the Middle East. Now, but it's also interesting to see that in certain countries, sexual relations between females, while there's no law, there's no express law outlawing sexual relationships between females. Of course, they are not allowed to marry, but essentially, it doesn't matter that they engage in sexual relations as long as they do it privately. But conversely, for male and male relations, it's outrightly banned, and in fact, in about six of the countries in the Middle East, it is punishable by death. Then, of course, the other countries, depending on whatever it is, the nature of the sexual act, it ranges from life from different degrees of life of imprisonment, sometimes all the way to life. So you see that in Africa and in Asia, particularly the Middle East, there is still a deep anti-gay sentiment. The African, Asian, and Middle Eastern concept of society finds its roots within the family structure, and that's essentially how family is defined. Society or communities are defined by families, and so and of course it's a very broad and expanded definition of family. So family is not just a nuclear family of father or parents and children, but it oftentimes includes grandparents, uncles, aunties, and anybody else who grew up in the house. And so you see that when there's any kind of transaction at the family level, there are several stakeholders beyond just the parents. So a a gay or a lesbian girl, for example, deciding to announce to her family that she is a lesbian may be dealing with more than just her parents. And oftentimes, like, for example, in the Yoruba culture of Southwest Nigeria that I'm from, you have to build consensus on any issue as a family. So, for example, when I was going to get married, I had to introduce my fiance at the time to my uncles. And there had to be a general consensus among my uncles that she was okay to marry. If there was one single dissenting voice, it would have delayed the whole wedding ceremony until, for some reason, he's convinced otherwise. So, drawing from that kind of situation, if I were to come out of the closet and say, "Oh, now I'm gay," I would have my father's 11 brothers to contend with. Otherwise, I would very quickly be disowned by the family. And because the society or the communities are interlinked via family, the implication is the rejection of one's family is the rejection of the society or the community in which that person is living. And so you see that as a counterculture, it becomes a big issue that you're constantly, the LBGTQ community is constantly at loggerheads with whatever society it finds itself in within a broad spectrum of countries. All right, so as far as social acceptance is concerned, you find very little of it, and if at all there is any, it is often just tolerated, not accepted, which is a converse situation in Western cultures where it is a subculture and it is beyond just tolerated or it has become acceptable. Of course, that also then spills over to the workplace. Because, for example, there are laws in some countries about same-sex marriage, and in some cases, in some countries, there are actually anti-gay laws. So, in other words, any kind of practice of anything outside heterosexual relationships and the binary male-female gender definition is outlawed. So the implication for getting a job for somebody who's openly gay, for example, is that anybody hiring that person is breaking the law by necessary implication. And so, of course, we can stretch that to the question of laws and human rights. Now, because the LBGTQ community has been accepted as a subculture in Western many Western countries, gay rights have attained a new definition to actually mean that to actually mean human rights. And because gay rights have been defined, or let me say, human rights has been expanded to include gay rights, there's often a clash of interests. And you see that with even the voting patterns that at the United Nations Human Rights Commission, where Western countries voted for gay rights to be included among the human rights, basic human rights, and African and Asian countries, Nigeria inclusive, and 45 other countries, outrightly said no, it shouldn't be. And probably the biggest player in the whole transaction didn't that abstained was China, who chose not to vote on the matter. But as a digression here, you then find out that the abstinence of China from voting emboldened many of the African and Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries to say, well, the worst that can happen, and then we see that ultimately playing out, was for the Western countries to attempt to sanction countries that had passed anti-gay laws, and oftentimes such actions included restricting of aid to those countries, to which countries like China and Iraq were Iran rather were more than willing to step in and fill the void that would be created by such such penalties, if you like, against such countries. Okay, so essentially, one part of the world considers gay rights as human rights, and another part of the world doesn't. And so, if you happen to find yourself in the part of the world where it doesn't, then you obviously will be functioning within a counterculture. Of course, there's a question of political acceptance. And in most democracies, laws cannot be passed without political will, without the political class. And so when the political class, as an extension of society or as an integral part of society, is unwilling to take the position of accepting gay rights, then you find out that every other thing will flow from there. And so whether it's the laws that are designed or the courts interpreting it, and because again, no matter how a law is worded, the courts almost always look at the societal implication of reaching a decision or a verdict. And so, yeah, so political acceptance is oftentimes at variance with the the culture, the LBGTQ culture. So let's watch this little clip. Yeah. So ultimately, we just in conclusion, the LBGTQ um, culture, if you like, we could refer to it as that, operates as a counterculture in still operates as a counterculture in many countries. And the question that we have or I have is to say, what do you think accelerated the pace of acceptance of LBGTQ plus as a subculture in American society? And maybe the follow up to that question would be to say, how can that happen in in countries and in cultures right now where it is outrightly unacceptable to be gay? Thank you.